Can you imagine waiting in an airport for 3 days without anyone noticing? Now imagine the reason behind it. A reason that will leave you speechless. Today, we're going to tell the story of an elderly man who sat on the floor of an airport, waiting. But the reason was not what anyone could have imagined. No one noticed his pain until security found out what was going on. And when they did, it was too late to prevent what happened next. Stay until the end to understand what happened and what this man was really facing. This story will move you in ways you never imagined. The man sat there in silence as the airport bustled around him, frantic and relentless. He didn't care about the sound of hurried footsteps, the low voices of passengers talking about their journeys, or the loudspeaker announcements about upcoming flights. None of that mattered to him. He wasn't there for a tourist or business destination. He wasn't there for a return flight, for an adventure, or for some other common travel reason. What brought him to that airport was not just the circumstances of a missed flight, but something deeper, a silent search for something that only he understood. The only thing that moved him was hope. A hope that, over the days, was slowly slipping away, like sand dripping through his fingers, without him being able to stop it. He was in no hurry, but time passed. Somehow, he was immune to the rush around him. What he was waiting for was no longer just any flight. He was waiting for the last chance to recover something he had lost a long time ago. And because he didn't seem to be in a hurry, no one really seemed to notice what was happening. When anyone looked at him, they saw only a tired old man, with an expression of someone who had already lived through his best experiences and was now waiting for the inevitable. The reality, however, was very different. The man was there waiting for something more than just a trip. He was waiting for something he was no longer sure would come. He was waiting for someone he loved more than anything else in the world, someone he hadn't seen for years, someone who had been his reason for living. He had lost touch with his daughter a long time ago. Life had gotten complicated for her, and they had drifted apart over the years. He didn't know exactly what had happened. He just knew that, over time, she had drifted away, until she had completely disappeared from his life. He didn't understand why, but he was determined to do everything he could to find her. And when he finally received a letter from her saying that she was coming to visit him, everything changed. He knew that this was his last chance, the last gasp of a hope he had nurtured for so long. The old man wasn't just there for a date. He was there to finally see his daughter again, after so many years of loneliness. He needed that. He was waiting for his life to finally make sense again. It was a mixture of emotions: fear, anxiety, but above all, a firm belief that this moment would be like the last piece of the puzzle. For years, he had tried to get in touch, sending letters, phoning, but the answers were always vague, always with lame excuses that made no sense. But now, finally, she was coming back. He didn't want to think about anything but her face. He didn't want to question the truth of that promise. When he saw her pass, an old man's heart filled with hope. It was as if time had stood still, and he was only there for a greater purpose, one that he knew he could still achieve. His hopeful gaze, although heavy with wear and tear, reflected more than just expectation. It was a need to salvage what was left of his life. The routine at the airport continued around him, indifferent. People rushed past, with their bags, their conversations, their own destinations, oblivious to the man sitting there. Airport security did the bare minimum, just checking his identity from time to time, as they did with all passengers. They didn't know that the silent figure sitting on the plastic seat wasn't just a traveler, but someone on the verge of something greater than any flight could bring. He was, in fact, waiting to reconnect with a lost piece of his life. Time seemed to be his only companion and solitude his only comfort. But with each passing day, he felt a growing emptiness in his chest, a sense that time was passing too quickly, that perhaps the expected moment was no longer possible. He didn't know, in fact, if she would come. But that didn't seem to change anything. Under no circumstances could he give up on his belief. He no longer had the strength to give up on something so important, something he believed would be his last chance at redemption. He had waited so long, endured so much suffering, that he could no longer turn his back on the only hope that remained in his life. Expectation was all he had. And with each passing day, he felt further away from what could be the most anticipated meeting of his life. That was the big challenge. The man wasn't just waiting for a flight. He wasn't just trying to travel from one place to another. He was waiting to give his life meaning again. And in the meantime, he went unnoticed by everyone around him, like an invisible among the shadows. People saw the figure of an old man with a tired countenance, but they didn't know that he was carrying the weight of a long and painful weight, a weight that had no limits. And while the clock ticked relentlessly, he clung to the last fraction of time he believed he could still control. He was about to discover something that no one had imagined would happen there, but to do so, he first had to deal with the truth that what he feared most could, in fact, come true. The third day dawned and the old man was still there, on the same bench, with the same small suitcase at his feet. His face looked even more tired, but his determination had not waned. The airport, however, seemed to have noticed something. It was unusual for someone to stay there for so long, especially without an apparent destination. Security had started watching him more closely. The cameras had captured his presence repeatedly. One of the security guards, a man called Miguel, who was always on patrol in the boarding area, began to comment to his colleagues about the elderly man who never seemed to leave his seat. "Have you noticed that gentleman in the corner? He's been here since the day before yesterday," said Miguel to a colleague. The other shrugged, thinking it was probably just another passenger waiting for a long connection. But Miguel couldn't ignore the feeling that something was strange. He noticed that the elderly man hardly ate, only accepting small gestures of kindness from strangers who sometimes offered a little food or a drink. He also noticed that the man rarely got up. His behavior was not that of an ordinary traveler, but of someone bound by a mysterious purpose. Finally, curiosity overcame Miguel. He approached the elderly man, pretending to be just another employee checking in passengers. He greeted him politely, but the man didn't respond immediately. He seemed distant, trapped in his own thoughts. When he finally looked up, Miguel saw something that completely disarmed him. The old man's eyes weren't just tired, they were full of pain, the kind of pain that seemed to be carried for years. He asked the man if he was all right, if he needed help, but the answer was brief and evasive. "I'm waiting for my daughter," he said, in a voice that was almost lost in the hubbub of the airport. Miguel, intrigued, tried to continue the conversation, but the man didn't reveal much more. He went back to looking at the international arrivals gate, as if every person who came out of there could be the one he was waiting for. Miguel returned to the security checkpoint, but he couldn't get the old man out of his mind. The feeling that something was deeply wrong began to grow. He decided to check the airport's internal system, just to understand more about the passenger. On searching, he discovered that the man's name was on a flight that had arrived 3 days earlier. However, there was no record of him having boarded another flight, nor of anyone traveling with him. There were no reservations at nearby hotels, nor any reports of anyone looking for him. It was as if he was completely alone. This information alerted Miguel, who decided to report the situation to his superiors. The security team met and agreed that it was necessary to speak to the elderly man again, but this time in a more direct manner. When Miguel returned to where the elderly man was, he noticed that something had changed. The man looked even more dejected. His suitcase, which had previously been closed, was now open, revealing few belongings. Some simple clothes, a toothbrush and, at the bottom, a small photograph. Miguel, careful not to frighten him, asked to see the photo. The elderly man hesitated, but eventually handed over the picture. It was an old black and white photo of a young woman smiling. Miguel asked who it was, and the answer was quick and full of emotion. "My daughter." This simple answer brought a wave of questions to Miguel's mind. Who was she? Where was she? Why had he been waiting so long without news? Something seemed deeply wrong, and Miguel knew he couldn't just let it go. He returned to the system and asked other colleagues to help him investigate further. After a few hours of research, they discovered something disturbing. The elderly man's daughter's name did not appear in any recent records. There were no tickets purchased in her name, and no flight history to indicate that she was on her way to the airport. Even stranger, there was no record of her in any recent database, as if she had disappeared off the map. Miguel felt a chill. He began to fear the worst, but knew he couldn't just confront the old man without any concrete information. He went back to him and tried to talk again, this time being more direct. He asked if he was sure his daughter would come. The man replied firmly. "She promised. She sent a letter. She said she'd meet me here." Miguel asked to see the letter, but the old man began to close his eyes, clearly uncomfortable. It seemed that the mere mention of questioning his daughter's promise hurt him deeply. Despite this, Miguel managed to convince him to show him the envelope. It was an old letter, the paper already yellowed by time. The sender's address was smudged, but Miguel managed to spot something disturbing. The date on the envelope was almost 10 years ago. The old man didn't seem to notice the discrepancy. For him, time was a confusing thing, and his daughter's promise, regardless of when it had been made, was still valid. Miguel, however, understood that something much bigger was going on there. This discovery brought the security team to a standstill. They were facing a situation that went far beyond their day-to-day responsibilities. Miguel felt he couldn't leave the elderly man alone, but he knew they needed help. It was at this point that he made a decision that would change everything. He called the local authorities and a social welfare service, explaining the situation in detail. He knew that there was something deeper to the old man's story, something that needed to be revealed. And although the outcome was still uncertain, he was determined to find out the truth. The social work team arrived accompanied by a community police officer, a psychologist, and an experienced social worker. Miguel was waiting anxiously for them in the terminal as he explained the details of the case and shared what he had found out about the letter. When they finally approached the elderly man, he looked at them with a mixture of weariness and suspicion. It was as if he knew that his wait, so full of hope, was about to be interrupted by something stronger than he could bear. The psychologist began to talk to him, with a careful approach, but every word seemed to crumble his fragile resistance. The elderly man began to reveal pieces of his story, like a jigsaw puzzle that only made sense at the end. He told us that his daughter, Marina, was his only family. He had lost his wife to a sudden illness many years ago, and since then he and Marina had become inseparable. But as time went by, Marina grew up, built her own life, and eventually moved to another country in search of better opportunities. At first, they spoke often, but gradually the calls became less frequent, the letters more scarce, and the distance between them, both physical and emotional, seemed insurmountable. It was then that he received the last letter. In it, Marina promised that she would visit him. She said she missed him and had taken some time off to sort out her life. The elderly man believed her wholeheartedly, clinging to that promise like a lifeline. He sold what was left of his simple house and used the money to buy a ticket to the airport, certain that she would be waiting for him. He didn't even consider the possibility that something could have gone wrong. For him, Marina was his anchor, his reason for existing. While he was telling this story, The social worker next to him was using her tablet to continue checking information. She noticed something that froze the air around her. Not only had Marina not been on any recent flights, but there were records that she had died in a car accident almost a decade ago. Her name appeared in an obituary, accompanied by an old photo that clearly matched the young woman in the old man's photograph. It was a crushing blow, and the social worker had to leave for a moment to process the impact of this discovery. Meanwhile, the old man continued to talk about Marina, describing her laugh, the way she made plans for the future, and how she used to squeeze his hand when she was a child, promising that they would always take care of each other. He spoke with such certainty and love that no one had the courage to interrupt him. Miguel felt a heaviness in his chest, wondering what it would be like to hear the truth and, even more so, how to communicate it to a man who had spent 3 days waiting for a miracle that would never come. When they finally decided to reveal the truth, silence overtook the small group. The psychologist began by gently explaining that they had investigated the information about Marina and that there was something important he needed to know. She said it was hard to hear, but that he wasn't alone in facing it. Every word seemed to weigh tons, and the elderly man initially just stared at the psychologist, as if his brain refused to process the information. "Marina." "She can't come, sir," she said, choosing her words carefully. "She had an accident many years ago." For a moment, everything stopped. The old man blinked, confused, as if trying to fit it into the narrative he had constructed in his mind. He shook his head, silently denying it, and repeated, almost in a whisper, "She promised. She promised she would come." His hands trembled as he clutched Marina's photograph, holding it tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping him together. The psychologist tried to console him, explaining that sometimes our minds protect us from painful memories by creating a kind of barrier. Perhaps he knew, somewhere deep in his soul, what had happened to Marina, but had chosen to hold on to the promise so as not to lose himself completely. However, the emotional impact was undeniable. The old man began to cry, not a loud, desperate cry, but a silent sob, laden with a pain that seemed to crush everything around him. Miguel, who had remained silent until that moment, approached. He didn't know what to say, but he put a hand on the old man's shoulder, trying to offer some kind of comfort. The simple but sincere gesture seemed to break some of the loneliness the man felt. He looked at Miguel and said something no one expected. "I knew it. Deep down, I knew. But I couldn't accept it." The welfare team offered immediate support. They assured him that he would be taken to a place where he could rest and receive care. The psychologist started talking about programs to help him process the loss, and the social worker promised to help him regain some stability. But even as these practical solutions were discussed, it was clear that the elderly man was still lost in a world where Marina existed. He put the photo in his pocket and accepted the help, but not before taking one last look at the landing door, as if there was still a glimmer of hope that she would appear. This moment was the culmination of everything. The pain of a loss denied for years, the courage to finally face the truth, and the decision to carry on, even with a broken heart. Everyone in the group felt the impact of that instant, and the airport, so full of life and movement, seemed to have become a heavier and, at the same time, more human place. While the elderly man was being guided out of the terminal by the welfare team, something remarkable happened. Several airport employees, who had been following the situation from afar, gathered along the way. It was as if the weight of the story had touched everyone, breaking the impersonal routine of the place. Miguel, who walked alongside the elderly man, noticed small gestures that seemed to say much more than words. A security guard who took off his hat in respect, an attendant who discreetly wiped away tears, and even passengers who stopped to look, not knowing exactly what had happened, but feeling the gravity of the moment. The elderly man, still holding Marina's photo, walked slowly, as if the weight of the revelation was making him more fragile. But amidst the pain, something began to change. Miguel noticed a slight smile at the corner of the man's lips when he stopped to watch a mother with her young daughter playing in the lobby. He seemed to be remembering something good, something that, for a moment, softened the pain. It was as if he had begun to understand that, although Marina was no longer physically present, she was still alive in his memories, in the moments they had shared and in the love he still felt. When they reached the exit, the social worker handed the elderly man a small envelope. Inside was a letter written by her and the psychologist, offering information about the services that could help him, but also a message of sincere support. "You are not alone," the last sentence read. "There are those who care." He looked at the paper for a few seconds and, with a shy nod, put it in his pocket next to Marina's photo. As the car that would take him to the temporary shelter drove off, Miguel stood still, watching. Something had changed in him, too. He felt that this experience was not just about the old man, but also about him and all the others who were going through their own silent battles. There was a lesson there, one about compassion, about the power of small actions, and, above all, about how humanity can reveal itself in the most unexpected moments. Want to see more touching stories like this? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And for those of you who like a good story and watch to the end, leave your comment. I stayed until the end. Remember, the most valuable lessons come from the most difficult moments. See you in the next video.